Any questions from, I know it's been a while from the last class that we had when we went over layouts, media queries, responsive design, whatnot? No? Okay. Today we're going to talk about advanced layouts, whatever that means. Pretty much we're just going to talk about the new types of CSS3 features such as Flexbox and CSS Grid, and then we're going to jump into three popular frameworks that you can use for doing grid layouts and stuff. So we'll just get started here. So Flexbox is it's a new CSS property that enhances essentially float and the position property for CSS. It's pretty widely supported. We've been using, I think, mostly float and position to adjust where things go on the page. This gives you more control in terms of giving you that effect of, like the medium.com website or YouTube where you have that whole grid of stuff. This is a popular website. Has anyone ever heard of this? CanIuse.com? No. This site essentially tells you what features browsers support. So in this case here, I have the Flexbox feature, right? And we can see it shows Edge, Firefox, Chrome, Safari. It'll go back about 3 or 4 versions of the major version of the browser. And as you can see here, we got a lot of green, so it's been pretty widely accepted for a while, except for IE11. IE11's got partial support, I guess. I think, though, I don't know how accurate this is because I know in Internet Explorer you can use the Edge layout engine, but I guess we'll take this site's word for it that might be referring to the actual the native layout engine in IE11 has partial support. But I think anyway IE11's going wayside for Edge because Edge is that's Microsoft's new browser that's probably going to take over Internet Explorer. But so Flexbox is pretty widely supported and solves the following types of scenarios you may have. So, for example, if you have a block that you're looking to vertically center inside of the parent element, you can do that with Flexbox. Making all the children of a container take up, this is a big thing, an equal amount of available width and height, regardless of how much width and height is available on the page. And for making all columns in a multiple column layout adopt the same height, even if they contain a different amount of content. So you usually use that overflow property to do that. So if the content is greater than the height or the width, you can use overflow and it will give you essentially scroll elements. So this is different types of, so in order to use Flexbox, you have to set the element that's going to be the parent element. You're going to have a parent element and then child elements within it. So the parent element has to have the CSS property display flex. And then you have different, these are the basic settings. There's a bunch more, but the basic settings you have is the direction, which is going to tell you whether to stack the items either horizontally or vertically. You can have it stacked vertically as well. And the if you wanted to wrap when the width is, when the items don't fit in the width of the container, you can have them wrap, and you can have them wrap in a certain order, like reverse order or ascending order. And then there's shorthand. You can do flex flow, which is shorthand for both the direction and the wrap element. And then I have an example here for this little code pen example. So you can see in this example here, I have a flex container, and then the container has a div definition here. And I have this one class. All I have is this div with the flex container class that gets applied to all these divs within it here. And if I were to just blow this up here, you can see how it. So right now, I believe if I try to shrink it, if I shrink this window here, it's just going to make everything the same defined dimensions here. And then there's some properties I can do to have it do other things. So, for example, if I wanted it to stack as columns, I have it commented out, but I can uncomment it and have it stack like this. And then you can also, like, this helps with like media queries too. Like, say if you're using CSS media queries in conjunction with this, you can say that, well, when the page becomes a certain width, instead of having it stack horizontally, have it stack vertically using this flex column direction. You can also, so we're going to do, I'll do the wrap now. Whoops. So this is the wrap here. So if I uncomment this out, so what happens there is it'll actually wrap down. So you can see here that this row was too, this item was too wide for the row, and then what will happen is it'll wrap. It actually wrapped in reverse. So like, I think this was the last item in that list there, and then this was the second, and then this was the, or no, this was the first, and then this was the second. So you can specify or you can just say, I think you just say wrap. So if I were to take that out and just say wrap, then it just does it in the, you know, the order that the items were in. And then you can also have it where you do the shorthand, where the shorthand just does the same thing here. So instead of using both of these items, you can just do the one here and then have row wrap, and then that's the same as, or if we do column here, if we say column, actually column wrap doesn't really make sense because there's really no wrapping that's happening when you have it in that setting, but you kind of get the idea here. Any questions on that? Yep. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So we're going to get to that. So what you can do to have them all the same size in Flexbox here. So I think the way I have it now is we can actually say, so let's go back here. So I uncomment that out, and then we can do width here. Say we want them all to be 300 px, right? So now that makes all of these 300 pixels wide. if you want it where they stretch across, you can actually say something like percentage. So you have to base it off of, you have to know the number of items and the your width. So in this case, we have 3 items. So 3 divided by, 3 divided by 100 is 33%. So if we did 33%, that would give you essentially equal width on all the items. But then the problem is if we added another div element, we'd have to adjust it. So then we'd have it be 25%. So the more items you add to the column, to the list of columns, you have to adjust the width for it. When we talk about CSS Grid in a minute, there's an easier way where you just specify like a fraction. So you would just say 1 FR, and that would just, all the items in that row would be equal distant apart. And then you can also say, oh, I want an item to be, instead of 1 FR, 2 FR, which is like double. So like if you had 4 items, or if you had 3 items and you specified that you had 4 columns, you can say 1 FR, 1 FR, 2 FR. So then that would mean you'd have 2 items that are 25%, and then the last item would be 50%. I have an example that shows that, if I'm confusing you. But does that make some sense? Okay. Mm-hmm. The grid. So the grid is almost like you're defining almost like a table, but in CSS, and I'll get to that in a minute. So the flex box, you can only go, if you notice here, in one direction, right? Like when I set the, so that's the biggest difference, is that you can only have either row or column, which is, so you only have one direction with Flexbox. CSS Grid, you can have rows and columns. You can specify both rows and columns, which is good. And then the next question is usually with CSS Grid, well, why don't I just use tables then to do the same thing, right? So the reason for that is because with CSS Grid, because everything's defined in the layout, it's decoupled. That's what we call decoupling, when we take something, instead of having it embedded in the HTML structure, we're decoupling it and putting it into CSS. And then what that allows us to do is then we can have stuff like media queries adjusted. So for example, like let's say you had a sidebar, right? If you were to do that in an HTML table, you'd probably have it. I should have done an HTML example with this, but I didn't think of it, unfortunately. But for an HTML table, you'd have to define a TR, and then which is the row, and then the TD, which is the data elements in the column, right? Let's say, for example, you wanted it to move up. Say instead of it being on the side, so you had 3 rows, right? So you want to move it up to the first row, right, like in the upper left-hand corner. You would have to change the HTML structure, right, if it was defined as a table to do that. So instead of it being in the second TR element, right, you have to put it in the first TR element. So you probably have to manipulate the DOM, the document object model, to do that. Whereas with the CSS Grid, it's you can just put it in a media query, and I have an example that shows this, and it'll reflow the document for you. Mm-hmm. You'd probably use the CSS Grid, and I think a lot of people are actually they're moving away from like even using like Bootstrap or the Foundation, or they're actually moving away from those types of frameworks and just going with the CSS Grid, just because it's cleaner and you don't have to load a third-party library and be concerned with like compatibility and stuff. but the thing is though, it's pretty new, and I'll show you in the next example that I have for it with the Can I Use. You can see that prior versions of some of the browsers don't support CSS Grid. Most of these new frameworks that you see now, like Bootstrap and Bulma, they use the Flexbox element because it's so widely supported. And I'm sure in the future, like I said, either of these libraries will die out because CSS Grid just, trumps, whatever use case you had for these other. Probably not. I'm sure they'll still use them for the widgets and stuff, which I'll show you. But yeah, the Grid is essentially lets you go in the X, Y direction, whereas the Flexbox you can only go in either X, or Y. You can't do both. You have to decide. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? No. Okay. So that was Flexbox. And now we're getting right into CSS Grid. So CSS Grid allows you to define both row and column settings. And then, like you can see here, this is kind of what we were talking about last time we met, with the how we had like a header, sidebar, some content, footer, and whatnot. This gives you an easier way to define that in here. But the thing is, it's so new. Most, I believe, almost all, except for what is that? Was that Opera Mini? I don't know how many people use Opera Mini, but you can see even like in iOS, back in 10.2, it didn't support the CSS Grid yet, so it's still fairly new feature to have. But most modern browsers will support CSS Grid, which is a good alternative. CSS, just like Flexbox, CSS Grid's not going to work in earlier versions of, like, say, IE 10 or IE 9, which is, you'd probably use one of these CSS frameworks that I'm going to get to next if you had to do some sort of backward compatibility support for web browsers. It's amazing. I mean, a lot of places still use, like, IE. I remember when I worked at the County of Monmouth, I mean, they still used Internet Explorer. I think 10 was the one we had to support, because I think at the time 10 was like the last version before. And I think now what happened is Microsoft said we're not supporting anything prior to IE 11, because they used to have like a cycle, what do you call that? End of life cycle. I think end of life cycle for IE, I think it was IE 10 or IE 9. I think they might have been both around the same time. I think it was around 2015, end of 2015 or beginning of 2016. So it's pretty recent. It's a couple of years ago. But it's just like, like the old operating systems. I mean, you still have some ATMs out there. They still using Windows XP, and it's probably the worst possible OS to use, just with so many vulnerabilities and whatnot. But you still have people out there that use these older browsers. It's just something to keep in mind if you do have to support backward support some of these web browsers. So it allows for, like we were talking about before, alignment in both the X and Y direction, unlike Flexbox where you can only do in one direction. And then so the reason we do this, the reason you're going to use this over an HTML table, is because it allows you to decouple the table grid layout from the HTML structure and have it defined in CSS. And the greatest advantage is allowing you to come up with different media queries that adjust the layout nicely on different types of browsers and screen sizes. So this is an example I have here, how the grid works. So let's just move that over to the side here. You can see this is a pretty basic layout I have. I kind of define let me change the height on this here so you can see it a little better. Say this is, let me say 2. That's still too big? No, that's good. So you can see how easy that was just to adjust the height there. So in this example here, I have just a typical header, menu item on the left. This would be the content, and then a footer down here. And I have these different classes, and you can see the main class here, wrapper. I'm using the display grid. That's how you would tell it to use that features, to use display grid. And then we define the number of columns and then the number of rows that we have. So to define the number of columns, I'm using this special thing called repeat. So what this does is it essentially, instead of me typing out 1FR 12 times, I can say repeat 12 1FR, and that's the same as if I had typed it out 12 times on that row. And then what that says is that's the number of columns that we have defined for this layout here. You'll see, like when you look at if you look at Bootstrap, I think they're also a 12 column grid layout system, and I'll show you later when we talk about third-party libraries how that works. But so I've defined essentially 12 columns, and then I've defined three rows here with the header row being 40 pixels, the middle row being 200 pixels, and then the footer row being another 40 pixels. So those are the 3 rows there. And then for each of these, so I have a header, a menu, a content, a footer class, and I'm saying for the header class here, it's going to span 12 columns. So if I were to go and change this, say I could change this to 6, right? It's going to now shrink it 6 columns, but then it also is moving the menu up because the menu item here is moving up 4 columns here. So for me so what I would have to do is actually have another header here. If I were to go copy that, paste it in, and then then we have our full header row there. I think there's a property you can say where you don't. Well, I guess the issue here is the fact that it doesn't know what the end is for this. So like you have to have it doesn't know that these two are, like say, just because you have 2 different items doesn't mean it's going to be on a separate row. It's going to be until it actually fills that column span, if that makes sense. So for you to have it stretch, so let me just take that back out again. Set it back to what it was. I think it was 12 here. Right. So it doesn't necessarily know that, header is a separate row and that it should only span, it should be by itself essentially. In the other, when we look at Bootstrap and these other frameworks, that's what's nice about those frameworks is that you can actually specify rows and whatnot a lot cleaner than you can do in the CSS grid, because in the CSS grid you have to know, that these items are going to span across your column, essentially your virtual column width here. But anyway, so yeah, we have the header spanning 12. Then the next item is menu. Menu spans 4. Content spans 8. 4 plus 8 is 12, so it fills the whole 12-column list. And then footer is also spanning 12. But then I have a media query, so when I shrink this down to less than 800 pixels, hopefully I can shrink it down to 800 pixels. Let's see here. So if you notice what happened, when I shrink it down 800 pixels, that menu moves from the left and goes up into the top row of the header there, as if, like, say you were going to have, like, I don't know if you've seen this a lot, but when you shrink something down, like, say your menu list, it becomes, instead of it being a sidebar, becomes like a little icon that you click on, or even like a little list of menu items up at the top. So this is what this is a use case that you can do for CSS Grid with the media queries. So here what happens is, so right, when I shrink it, I change the span here of the header to be 6. And then for the menu, I'm telling it to go to grid row 1 and then span it 6. And then it just continues with, then it just adjusts the content to be 12 to fill up the entire column width there. And then the footer stays the same. Footer is always going to be span of 12. Any questions on this? Does that make sense at all? Yeah. Uh-huh. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you can, so in here, I think I have another, let me see the next example that I have. So, yeah, to do it in using the grid, you can do the fraction thing, which is what I'm going to get to next. So, as we said before, to initialize that grid, you do display grid. Then you have grid template columns, so that's going to define number of columns you're going to have, right? And then the template rows will define how many rows you have and the height. So columns are going to define the width, rows are going to define the height. And then each one of the items that you have in it, you can, if you look at this previous example, right, we had, so for menu, we said grid column spans 6, right? So in addition to using span, you can use what are called fractions. Or you can also say, instead of using span, you can use this notation, you know, it's 1 slash, so 1/5 is an example I have. So that means start at column 1 and end at, or start at line 1, if you look at the, like the grid over here, start at line 1 and then end at line 5. So that would span essentially 4 columns. It's kind of weird the way it's set up. And then you have grid row, which is pretty much the same thing, except it's for specifying rows instead of columns. So you can have something stretch multiple rows, for example. And then, so to do like if you wanted to do it in CSS Grid, have something be the same, like say width and height. You can also do height too. You can use what are called FR units. So FR units, they're essentially a fraction. So 1 FR is for 1 part of available space. So essentially, It's doing the calculation automatically. You know, if you have, say, you know, if you had 3 items in a 3-column grid, and you say 1 FR for each item, it's essentially going to set each one of those to width 33%. Or if you had 2 items in a 2-column grid layout, you have 1 FR, it'll set the width to 50%. So it'll be equal width. Does that make sense? So, for example, here, right? I have 2 examples. I have one where I just say one FR, right, for 4 columns, right? And that just means each one's going to be a quarter, right, in width. And the second example I have 1 FR, and then 60 pixels, and then 2 FR. And what that's going to do is going to do quarter, 60 pixels, and then half. So it essentially takes the 60 pixels out of the width, and then we'll divide up the rest of the available space left to the fractional units. And here's the example I have here. So let's bring up that example. Hopefully this makes sense here. So that was the first example here, right? So you can see each one of these are the same width, and I don't know if I did it for height. I think I just set all the heights to be 200 pixels. Heights are usually hard to get correct with percentage. Usually for you to have 100% height to work, your parent element has to be already defined to be a fixed height anyway. Because like I said in a prior class, you know, height's usually infinite because you can have essentially unlimited content on the page. So usually you don't figure out what the what the height is unless you have it predefined somewhere. And then that second example where I said 1 FR, 60 pixels, 2 FR, right? So there's that 60 pixels here, and then so this is wrapper 2, wrapper 1, wrapper 2, and then so these are essentially, so the 60 pixels is taken out of the total available width, and then this is divided into, these are, 25% of whatever's left of this available width, and then 2 FR is 50% of what's left of the, and the way you figure that out is just by the number of columns, divided by the fraction you have there. So this would be 1 over 4, 1 over 4, and then 2 over 4, which is 1/2. Mm-hmm. So since that's a defined set of pixels, will that never change to 60 pixels? Mm-hmm. Is it in that ratio? Mm-hmm. Yep, so if I go to shrink this here, I shrink this, still retains 60 pixels. And you can see, this is the farthest I can go down. But yeah, so it'll still keep that 60 pixels wide, on the, no matter what size the width is. In this scenario. Another kind of obvious. And I assume you can do this, but I was going to ask, do you put a grid in a grid? Yep. You do grids within grids. Yep. I didn't make an example with that, but yeah, just like tables, you can put tables within tables. You can do grids within grids, and what's great is you can then adjust to, like, say if the width wasn't filling up completely on the inner table or layout within that grid, you can have a media query that then goes and reflows the whole thing. So instead of it being a horizontal layout, have it be a vertical layout and have it stacked. Or scroll. Yep, you do an over. Yeah, that's another thing you do. You do the overflow X or Y depending on which direction you want it to scroll in, and have it scroll within the container element as well. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Mm-hmm.
What do you mean container?
What's that? I'm sorry. Container equal to. Is this in the assignment? Let me bring up the assignment here. And assignments. Was it this one or the square one? Container is an invisible box. I don't know what. I didn't write up the assignment. I mean, essentially, yeah. There's no. I think that just means there's no border around it. If you look at like the examples that we have here, like I think I called it wrapper in this case. The container is essentially this here. So this here would be considered the container, right? And these are the items within the container. So you wouldn't draw. I think that's what it's trying to get at. Don't draw like a border. In this case here, around the container. Draw it. Have it draw within the items. So for here, for example, right, I have the wrapper and then the items, and we look at the items. I believe there's a border set to actually draw the box around the items instead of the whole container itself. Does that make sense? Yeah, because all of these, when you're working with them, they're all boxes technically. They're really like boxes within boxes, and then you're just defining how these boxes are getting like laid out or what's within a box. Like, because even if you go to like the dev tools, I think one of the first things you see usually is what does the box look like for the what do I not have it up on here? If we do the Google one? Where's Google here? We're familiar with the Google. And if we do view developer, and then developer tools, and then if we were to we can see it right here. See that the box there. So like if we were to click, I still have that thing up. We click on that, showing us all of the box details, like so the padding within the box, right? The dimensions of the box, the border, so the border can be a certain thickness, and then the margin around it. And then even too, like when you see round stuff, there's really boxes. It's just that there's that special CSS property that rounds the edges around it. So for example, like you can have something look like a circle just by giving a very extreme border radius, so that it just essentially cuts those little box corners off, makes it into a circle. But yeah, so I think in the instructions there for the container being an invisible box, it's just saying just don't have anything drawn on the like a border. Don't have like a border or background color within the container element, which is like the parent essentially this guy here, the parent element, in this example here. So this is what's normally called that's the container here. This would be the container, and then these would be the items within the container. And then you can have containers within containers, just like with CSS Grid. You can have tables within tables, and it can go on for infinity. But does that make sense? Okay. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? No? Okay. I think after this, we're talking about, so is there any other questions about CSS Grid at all? No? Okay. So now we're going to talk about different, I call them CSS layout libraries. They're really, some of them, the two I have, Bootstrap and Foundation, they're almost like UX type of libraries because they add things in addition to giving you that type of grid layout. So many times it's much easier to use a well-established library to create your site layout than to actually go and, use CSS Grid and, come up with all the different media queries and the sizing and positioning and text and whatnot. A lot of times, and that's probably too what like Squarespace and Wix, they probably do the same thing. They probably have a pre-canned library, baked in that lets you go ahead and do this stuff. So most of the times, these libraries will have the following stuff built in. So they'll have usually some sort of layout system that adapts to both desktop and mobile browsers. And they're usually grid-based. They usually allow you to, usually there'll be a fixed number of columns that, just like with the CSS Grid, like we define our own set of columns. Usually there'll be some sort of like pre-existing number of columns that you have. It gives you stuff like typography, classes, helps you give distinctive text to your content. So like the H1, H2 headers will usually, you can usually put like what are called like modifiers, like CSS modifiers. That's like what I think we had done last time we met when I was showing the example with inheritance, when you have multiple CSS classes within an element. Usually like the second, class that you put in, you call that the modifier, and that does some sort of special thing. Like for example, like give some sort of like fade. If you wanted to have like text fade, you can add it to add a special class to the element, and it will fade the text automatically. So yeah, usually it has some sort of typography type of classes. So for example, I have alert, warning, information. So alert, for example, will probably be red. Warning will probably be yellow, information blue, etc. Also, usually will come with different sets of icons and glyphs that can be used to enhance menu items and buttons. So, like the question mark glyph, or the like say an email icon or something like that. So you don't have to put like email. You can actually just put the little icon in for your button. And then it'll also usually include UI widgets such as pop alerts, which are like pop-up boxes, dialogues, accordions, which are usually let you expand and contract elements dynamically, carousels for pictures, progress bars, tooltips, Scroll Spy, etc. How many people have used these type of widgets or seen them in other websites? I'm sure pretty much everyone has. They just probably don't recognize the name on some of them. Definitely the carousel. Like I think we just saw that with the IGN site we were just on. This is usually called the carousel here. This little like where'd it go? Would they change this around, or is this an ad or something? Usually, the carousel is usually the thing you see where you like click on it and it like shows a new picture, and you see like a preview at the bottom. If I refresh this here, I bet you they must have changed the website around. It's not showing it. No, not. But yeah, that's the carousel. So first library we'll talk about is Bootstrap. Bootstrap is an open source project originally developed by web developers at Twitter. I think it was like two guys that started it, and then it just blew up the open source world. How many people have heard or used Bootstrap? I probably asked this before. A couple people. It's probably the most popular one. It's been around for a long time. I saw this was on Wikipedia, the second most starred project on GitHub. It's a very popular library. I would say, this is subjective, but I kind of ranked it, with the three that we're going to talk about today. I would say this one's medium difficulty to learn and use compared to, say, Bulma. Bulma is just a straight-up CSS library, and Foundation. Foundation's it's a very large web framework that very complicated. I still can't wrap my head around the Foundation. Latest version is Bootstrap 4, which was just released this year. Bootstrap 4 was a complete rewrite of version 3, and it dropped support for IE 8.9 and iOS 6, which I think a lot of people don't even. So it still supports IE 10, which is surprising. And then this is the official website here. And I think I have an example I came up with.